Hi guys. Okay, so let's get started with, I'm not going to be really too much in the picture, but let's get started with the brain injuries. I'm going to use the PowerPoint just because it's a topic that um, I don't have a lot of information on other than the PowerPoints that we have. So we want to take a look at something simple. I need you to know this. I have quizzes that cover primary injury. We talked about secondary injury. You guys can look through your PowerPoints. And then really hematomas. So let's go over, oops, one more. So I want to just simplify it down conceptually because we're always talking about mechanism. Okay, so if you remember your anatomy courses, there's three meninges, right? There's and this is also quiz questions. So from the inside out, it's pad. So it's pia, arachnoid, and dura mater, and these constitute what we call the meninges. So the pia mater, between the pia mater, which actually sits on top of the brain, so the brain itself has, it's like a one cell layer thick membrane that encases the brain, almost like tofu. If you've ever seen tofu, the very soft inside is like the brain, and then the outside, when it's harder tofu, has like an outsider shell. So between the pia mater and the arachnoid is the subarachnoid space. And found in the subarachnoid space is actually what we call CSF, right? And we remember from back in the day that CSF is produced by the choroid plexus, right? Choroid plexus, and which is a part of the blood-brain barrier, right? So the choroid plexus makes the CSF. CSF washes over the ventricles, and I'm not going to write out the ventricles. There's other videos that you guys can use to look at this. But it covers or washes through the ventricles to help sustain, nourish, remove any kind of waste products, toxins from the brain structures themselves. Now, from the CSF and the brain, it actually will travel down from the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle, into the fourth ventricle, and now out through two structures. One is the median aperture of Magendie, and then there's two lateral apertures of Luschka. And then it enters into the subarachnoid space in that kind of, let me take this back. Let me just draw it simply. So let's say this is the ventricles. I'm not going to draw out the structure of the ventricles, but the CSF is made by the choroid plexus, enters into the ventricles, goes through the pathway of the lateral ventricles, the third, the fourth, exits through the median and lateral apertures, and then it goes into the subarachnoid space. That's where you find CSF. So once it travels into the subarachnoid space, it needs to recycle back to general circulation, right? So it goes through this thing's called arachnoid villi or arachnoid granulations. So it can enter into what we call the sinuses. The sinuses are also known as veins. Okay, so we have subarachnoid space, which has the CSF. That fluid travels into the veins, otherwise known as the sinuses. So the pressure here, I'm going to erase this and then we can take a look at the different pressures and you guys can conceptualize. If this is a vein, this is a container for the subarachnoid space in the CSF. Veins have a little bit higher pressure than CSF, but outside of the dura mater, in this area that we call the epidural space, right? Epidural. This is the subdural. These guys are arteries. Arteries tend to be high pressure, right? So if I was to rupture an artery, let's say you're playing baseball, you get hit on the side of the skull with a baseball. That's the reason why they tell you to use the safety gear. You get hit on the side of the skull. Not going to be tested, but I just want to go over it. There's a structure called the pterion. Pterion is actually where the different skull bones meet. So if you tear it, it will rupture inward and it'll actually cause, it'll rupture through the arteries inside of the brain, like the middle meningeal artery. So the meningeal artery has high pressure. So let's say you get hit in the side of the skull, you fall down, you pass out, you wake back up. Within a couple of hours, that patient could be dead. It's because of the high pressure that you find within the arteries. So veins, on the other hand, have a little bit lower pressure in relation to arteries. So it's slower for onset, slower for like development of symptoms, and you can probably sustain the injury a little bit longer before you come to the hospital and before death occurs, right? Subarachnoid space, even though the pressure is lower, it depends on what you're damaging. So in the subarachnoid space, there's actually communicating. So this one, when I do the review and the quizzes, it's going to say bridging veins, right? So arteries on top, veins in the middle, and then in the bottom, there's actually it's rupturing of aneurysms, right? So aneurysms are arteries, but in terms of how it relates, the arteries themselves kind of, there's like arteriovenous malformation, there's arteries that can rupture, like the cerebral arteries, and these cerebral arteries can have aneurysms, and these aneurysms can rupture, right? And then that can lead to injury in this subarachnoid space, right? And blood leaking into the CSF, okay? So one of the things that we're going to look at when we're looking at this is the difference between the three different types of hematomas. So like I said, epidural, between the dura and the skull, so epi on top, dura, manifestation, primary, and then let's see, usually it says like arteries, there we go, right here, arterial injury. So you guys want to make sure you associate arteries, high pressure, with the epidural hematoma. What about with the next one? The next one is subdural hematoma, and it's the layer between the dura and the arachnoid. So it's actually the subdural, right, beneath the dural layer, and it involves veins. So you guys want to remember that this second layer has veins. The pressure is a little bit lower. Therefore, like this says, the symptom onset may be slower, especially in comparison to the epidural hematoma, which are arteries. And then the last one on our list of three is the subarachnoid hemorrhage, right? Subarachnoid hemorrhage has CSF fluid, and there's arteries, cerebral arteries and cerebral aneurysms, arteriovenous malformations. When these guys rupture, it bleeds into the subarachnoid space, and a lot of times patients will say that it's the worst headache of their entire life, right? So collection of blood between arachnoid membrane and pia mater, rupture of bridging veins that pass through subarachnoid space, and more commonly associated with cerebral aneurysms or arteriovenous malformations. Although it is arterial in origin, CSF fluid itself has a lower pressure. So if you, let's say you hit your head and the brain tears off, somehow it separates at this point here, you might have a slow leak into the CSF level, or if you have a cerebral aneurysm rupture, then it might be a quicker response, and they say it's the worst headache they've ever had, right? Okay, so that's TBI. Let's stop at that one, and then we'll come back to the Alzheimer's portion later.